Hello, everyone. This is Wes Henson, and welcome to this week's On the Go Bible Study. I want to thank you for joining me today for this week's small group Bible study for the week of August the 4th, 2024. And on this podcast, we review and summarize the Bible Studies for Life series weekly lesson. Please take a few moments, check out the show notes, check out the description for links to this week's 2-page printed summary, and also there are several other study resources available there as well. If you're watching on YouTube, please do me a favor by hitting the subscribe button, hitting the thumbs up button, and also ringing the bell, and then that way you will not miss our next episode. Okay, let's begin this week's On the Go Bible study. So today we are in session 3 of our 6-week study titled More Than a Sidekick, Serving Alongside Others. And believe it or not, accept it or not, God created us to be team players. He created us to be connected to one another, providing support for one another, and operating in excellence regardless of our position or our title. And our greatest service to God is often in helping and supporting those who are in leadership positions. All right, if you remember, in our first week, we looked at the sidekicks of Aaron and Hur. And what we learned there was that leaders don't lead without the help of others. And if you remember that Aaron and Hur assisted Moses in enabling the Israelites to have victory over the Amalekites. And then last week, the sidekick that we looked at was Barak. Your service to God is valuable no matter who gets the credit. And while Barak led the Israelites against the Canaanite general Sisera, it was Jael who received credit for killing the general. So let's get started on this week's study. And this week's sidekick is David. He's the sidekick to King Saul. And the focus of this week's study is found in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and we're going to begin reading in verse 4 through verse 16. The point of our study this week is this: serve with excellence even when others do not appreciate that work. That's a tremendous truth, tremendous point to a lesson this week in our study. So let's begin 1 Samuel chapter 18. We're going to begin in verse 5. So David marched out with the army and was successful in everything that Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. And as the troops were coming back, when David was returning from killing the Philistine, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with a 3-stringed instrument. And as they danced, the women sang, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So Saul had sent David out on several military campaigns, and David completed the charge given to him every time. And so there's a principle here in these verses, and that is this: we need to give our best to whatever our leader calls us to do. And sure enough, David gave his best, and he followed King Saul's leadership in everything. He remained humble, and he even helped others achieve more as a result. And because he gave his best to everything his leader called him to do, David, as we read in these verses, was well respected, and he was honored by all. In verse 7, it says that Saul killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. But I want to explain that verse, if I can, for just a moment. So the practice of putting a number in the first line and then beefing it up, if you will, in the second line mirrored the style of the Hebrew poetry. So they would put one number in, like Saul killed his thousands, and then they would kind of add to it, if you will, for emphasis. But David killed his tens of thousands. Now you can be sure that there was no intention to make Saul feel inferior. In fact, Saul is the one who gets the top billing. And it was looked at in that day and time, the way that it was written in that language, that both Saul and David were honored for their victories on the battlefield. So some lessons and truths that we see here is, number one, we're to strive to be faithful and wise followers of those who are leading us. Now, let me make this assumption. We want to assume that we are faithful followers to those who ask us what to do is to be ethical, and we want it to be moral, and we want it to be godly. In other words, we want to assume what they ask us to do is not unethical, it's not immoral, and it's not ungodly. Okay, secondly, being a person who finds favor with others is a worthy objective. If we can accomplish it, it is well-founded, and it comes from being a person of integrity. And then thirdly, we are to celebrate the accomplishments of others who have served faithfully and served well. And then let me make one more point before we go into the next verses. Giving our best can bring joy to others as well as to ourselves. Okay, let's move on down to verses 8 through 11. So Saul was furious, and he resented this song. They credit tens of thousands to David, he complained, but they only credited me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. The next day, an evil spirit sent from God came powerfully on Saul, and he began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the lyre as usual, but Saul was holding a spear, and he threw it, thinking, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David got away from him twice. So David was so successful in what Saul charged him to do that Saul became envious and resentful of David. So a principle here from these verses is that excellence in our work is not always valued. When we do a good job, don't expect all the time everyone to appreciate it. Despite David being such a blessing to Saul, a blessing to his nation, a blessing to his family, Saul allowed bitterness and resentment to build toward David. And so we see here in verse 10, Saul playing out his jealousy. You see, the Spirit of God had departed from King Saul. We can read that back, I think, 1 Samuel chapter 15, or in that area. You can look and see. But the Spirit of God had departed from King Saul, and God had allowed an evil spirit, an evil something to torment him, as we read in verse 10. Now, let me kind of go through this just a little bit real quick. We know that God is not the author of evil. We know that God does not tempt people to do evil. James 1, 13, 14, and 15 will tell us that. However, the Spirit of God had departed from Saul, and as a result, this other spirit had come upon him. And Saul was not praying, was not asking God to help him overcome these evil thoughts. Instead, Saul began to verbalize these wicked feelings. So he just allowed it to take over in his heart and in his mind. And David was still loyal to Saul. He was playing his lyre as usual to help Saul. David had done that for years because it helped to soothe Saul's anxiety, if you will. But Saul this time had a spear in his hand, and he made 2 attempts on David's life. And even after the first attempt, David still attempted to minister to Saul with his music. But Saul did not value David, did not value his music ministry, or even his military accomplishments. And some of the lessons and truths from this passage is that envy, jealousy, and suspicion can destroy us. Secondly, we cannot control the thoughts and attitudes of others, but we can determine to do our best and not allow their evil intentions and actions to control us and prevent us from doing what is right. And then thirdly, how sad it is to see a person with great potential for good become so ill-spirited that they fail to develop that potential or accomplish the assignment before them. And truly, that was the fate of King Saul. Okay, let's look at these last verses, verses 12 through 16. So Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David and had left Saul. Therefore Saul sent David away from him and made him commander over 1,000 men. David led the troops and continued to be successful in all of his activities because the Lord was with him. And when Saul observed that David was very successful, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was leading their troops. So despite the fact that David's life had been physically threatened by Saul, David continued to be obedient and lead Saul's army. And furthermore, David continued to do well because God was with him. So a principle here in these verses is even when disrespected or opposed, continue to honor God with what you do. And the reason why Saul was dreadful or fearful of David was because David had what Saul didn't have, the presence of the Lord. Saul assigned David to be the commander of a special elite force of 1,000 men. And if you read on in verse 17, you'll see one of the motivations behind that for Saul was that, well, David might be in a better position to be killed leading these men, so that's why he did that. But David accepted the assignment and he excelled in his new role. And once again, it's recorded, verse 14, that David continued to be successful in all of his activities because the Lord was with him. David couldn't be stopped. With the presence of the Lord, David was guaranteed success. And David not only enjoyed success on the battleground, but he also continued to enjoy success on the home front as well. Okay, that's our lesson for this week, but how are we going to apply the truths of this lesson to our lives this week? Let me share with you 3 applications. Number 1, confess your shortcomings. Identify an area where you've not strived for excellence and commit to giving God your best in that area. We see that with David. David gave God the best that he had, regardless of the circumstances. Second application, give the credit to God. When you succeed or when others compliment you or praise you for a job well done, we can simply say, we want to give God the glory. Without the Lord, we could not do it. And then the third application is maintain your integrity. Always do the right thing, even when others are doing the wrong thing against you. Don't retaliate against hate, knowing that the presence of God is there for your peace of mind and your protection. Okay, before we go, our prayer this week, as we leave our study, is that we would thank God for blessing us with the opportunity to serve Him. We're thankful that we are part of God's plan. And then secondly, we want to ask the Lord to help us to serve with excellence even when others do not appreciate it. All right, that's our lesson for this week. Thank you for joining me today. And again, you can check out all of the resources in the show notes and also in the description. And I'll look for you next time. And bye for now.